Walter Bramble and the Houseboat in the Rain. Chapter 1. The Boat at Willow Bend. Walter Bramble had never slept on a houseboat before. He had slept in hotels, guest houses, spare rooms, railway compartments, a caravan in Dorset, and, on one regrettable occasion in 1987, an armchair belonging to a man called Geoffrey, who snored even while he was awake, but never a houseboat. This had never troubled him particularly. There were, after all, a great many things a person could go through life without doing. He had never milked a goat, never played the trombone, never owned trousers made of leather. Until Mrs Finch mentioned it over tea one Tuesday morning, Walter had never felt any urgency about sleeping on a boat either. Mrs Finch lived 3 cottages along from Walter in Bramble Lane, and she had a slightly disconcerting habit of discovering things Walter ought to do before Walter himself knew he wanted to do them. "My cousin has a houseboat," she said. Walter looked up from the biscuit tin. "Does she?" "On the canal. That does seem the usual place for one." Mrs Finch ignored this. "She's going to Yorkshire for 4 days. She needs someone to keep an eye on the boat." "Why? It's tied to the bank, isn't it?" "Boats still need looking after." Walter considered what a boat tied to a bank was likely to get up to, decided not to ask, and helped himself to a second digestive instead. Outside the kitchen window, a weak October sun was crossing the roofs of Bramble Lane. "And what does keeping an eye on a houseboat actually involve?" "Very little. There's a stove, a kettle, a proper bed. Electricity, hot water, a little kitchen. Margaret says you can stay there if you like." Walter stopped chewing. "For 4 days? 2 would do." "Why me?" "Because you'll enjoy it." Walter had learned to be suspicious of any sentence that began with "because you'll enjoy it." Such sentences had led him, in the past, to line dancing, a village quiz night conducted entirely through a faulty loudspeaker, and a guided tour of a sewage treatment works. Mrs Finch poured more tea. "The forecast says rain. That doesn't sound like an advantage. It will be on a boat, rain on the roof." Walter thought about that, and found he rather liked the idea. A little floating room, a stove, a kettle, rain overhead. No lawn to attend to, no telephone unless he brought his own, no particular reason to be anywhere. When? Thursday. 2 mornings later, Walter put a small suitcase in the boot of his car and drove 37 miles to a place called Willow Bend, a village consisting of a church, a pub, 12 houses, a postbox, and a shop whose front window held more handwritten notices than actual merchandise. Beyond the village, a narrow lane dropped down towards the canal, and Walter followed it slowly. Autumn had arrived properly overnight. The hedges were dark with moisture, copper leaves clung to the verges, and above the fields the sky had settled into one continuous sheet of pale grey. The first drops of rain touched his windscreen just as he reached the water. "Right on time," he said. Willow trees lined the towpath, their long branches trailing towards a canal that lay almost perfectly still except where the rain found it. 6 boats were moored along the bank. Walter parked beside a wooden shed and read Mrs Finch's instructions again. 3rd boat after the bridge. Green roof, brass chimney, water lily, key under the flower pot. There were 7 flower pots. The first held soil, the second a dead geranium, the third 3 snails, and the fourth, at last, the key. Good system, Walter murmured. The water lily was longer than he had expected, her hull deep blue with cream panels round the windows and narrow green borders, a painted water lily on either side of her name. A little chimney rose from the roof, and 3 brass vents gleamed under the thickening rain. Walter crossed the short gangplank. The boat moved beneath him, only slightly but unmistakably. He stopped. It stopped. He stepped forward again, and it moved again, and he looked down at the canal with something close to suspicion. "I see," he said. Houses, in Walter's experience, generally stayed where the architect had put them. He unlocked the door and stepped into warm, woody air. The interior was narrow but far more comfortable than he had expected. A cushioned bench beneath the window, a small table, 2 shelves of books, and beyond them a cast-iron stove. A kitchenette held a kettle, a 2-ring cooker, a sink and cupboards, and a corridor barely wider than Walter himself led past a small bathroom to a bedroom with a double bed under another window. He set his case on the bed. Rain tapped lightly on the roof, not loudly, just enough to hear. Tap, 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 tap. Walter stood quite still. Mrs. Finch had been right, and he disliked it slightly when she was right this quickly. A note lay on the table. "Dear Walter, make yourself at home. Water tank is full, logs are beside the stove, tea is in the blue tin, coffee is in the red one, biscuits are in the cupboard above the sink. Don't worry about the ducks. Margaret." Walter read the last line twice, then looked out through the window. There were no ducks in sight. "That," he said, "is precisely the sort of sentence that makes a man start worrying about ducks." He unpacked without hurry, 2 shirts into a narrow wardrobe, his wash bag into the bathroom, his slippers by the bed, his book onto the little table by the stove. Mrs. Finch had also sent him off with 4 cheese scones in a paper bag, which he set beside the biscuit tin. By the time he had finished, the rain had settled into something steady, running in thin lines down the glass. Across the canal, the willow branches had begun to drip. Walter filled the kettle, and when he turned the tap, a pump somewhere beneath the floor gave a brief hum that made him freeze until it stopped. He tried it again. Then water. He nodded. One learned things. He made tea from the blue tin, exactly where it had been promised, and sat by the window to watch the rain. A canal, he decided, was an unusually good place from which to watch weather. On land, rain fell and simply vanished. Here it had somewhere to arrive, and every drop drew its own small circle on the surface, thousands of them appearing and overlapping and gone. Smoke curled from a chimney on one of the boats opposite, and further along the towpath, a man in a yellow waterproof walked beneath an umbrella, while a black spaniel investigated every clump of wet grass. Nobody hurried. There seemed little point. A soft bump came from somewhere near the stern. Then another. Walter remembered Margaret's note and went to the back door to find 3 mallards gathered beside the boat, one with its head under water, one staring directly at him, and the third pecking steadily at the hull. "Good afternoon," Walter said. The pecking continued. "I was told not to worry about you." The duck seemed unmoved by this information, and Walter went back inside. The rain strengthened, the tapping on the roof thickening into a soft, continuous patter, and Walter fed another log to the stove. He'd arrived a little after 11, and by 12:30 he had done everything there was to do. Kettle full, fire lit, case unpacked, ducks acknowledged. Nothing else remained. He sat down and found this strange. At Bramble Cottage there was always something, a hinge, a gutter, a cupboard, a letter wanting a reply, a patch of garden behaving suspiciously. Here there was only rain, and Walter opened his book to it, and for the first time in a very long while found himself inside a house with absolutely no reason to improve anything. Chapter 2. Rain on the Roof. By 2:30 the rain had well and truly settled in. It no longer seemed to be passing through. It had arrived. Walter had eaten one of Mrs Finch's scones and read 38 pages of a history of Britain's canals, a book he had brought along entirely by accident, having grabbed it from beside his bed without thinking. Reading about boats while sitting on one struck him as an unplanned but not unwelcome piece of symmetry. He learned about locks and towpaths, working boats carrying coal and grain and pottery, and about journeys that took most of a day in the 18th century and could now be done by motorway in under an hour. Walter found he rather approved of the slower version. Some distances, he thought, had been spoiled by being made too easy. A narrowboat came under the bridge as he watched, moving so slowly that he tracked its approach for the better part of 4 minutes, its passing for 2 more, and its retreat for another 5, the man at the tiller in no apparent hurry whatsoever. Its wake reached the water lily eventually, rocking her gently enough to shift the teacup on its saucer, and then everything went still again. "Quite enough excitement," Walter said, and picked his cup back up. At 3 o'clock someone knocked on the window. A woman stood on the towpath under a large green umbrella, 70 or so, in a waterproof coat with a canvas shopping bag over one arm. "You must be Walter." "I generally am," she smiled. "I'm Nora. Next boat along." She nodded downstream towards a red narrow boat called Mabel Rose. "Margaret said you were staying." "Only a couple of nights." "First time on a boat? Is it that obvious?" "You keep looking at the ropes." "I like to know what's holding things together." "Sensible man." She handed him a small loaf wrapped in paper. "Baked too. Margaret feeds my cat when I'm away, so it seemed only fair." "I haven't seen a cat." "That's because he's still on my boat, deciding whether you're worth the walk. He's called Stanley. He'll come and inspect you eventually." Before she left, Walter remembered the note. Margaret said not to worry about the ducks. Nora laughed. "They knock when they want feeding. Don't feed them." "Why not?" "They'll bring friends. All of them." He thanked her for the warning, and at 4:15 Stanley arrived, a large ginger cat with a white chest and the unhurried manner of an inspector sent by head office. He let himself in, without waiting to be asked, toured the stove, the bench, the kitchenette, Walter's slippers, and the bedroom, then settled onto the cushioned bench, as though the matter were now closed. "I take it this is satisfactory," Walter said. Stanley began washing a paw and offered no further comment. He stayed 47 minutes, acknowledged Walter not once more in that time, and then asked to be let out with no explanation at all. Dusk came early. By 5 the far bank had lost its detail, the willows reduced to shapes, the towpath lamps coming on one by one and stretching long reflections down through the water. Walter lit the little lamp beside his chair, and the whole cabin changed character at once. amber and warm inside, while the cold rain carried on outside the glass. He heated the soup Margaret had left in the fridge, leek and potato, the label reading "Made Monday," perfectly safe, a reassurance whose necessity Walter chose not to dwell on. With Nora's bread and a little butter, it made a fine supper, eaten at the small table while rain ran down the window and the boat rocked now and then as another narrowboat went past. There was, he thought, a particular comfort in being shut in by bad weather. Sunshine always seemed to suggest an obligation, to walk somewhere, to garden, to remark on the pleasantness of the day. Rain asked nothing at all. Rain simply said, "Stay where you are, put the kettle on, read another chapter." At 7, he found a radio station broadcasting something about the restoration of a steam locomotive's boiler, understood perhaps a third of it, and left it on anyway, since that seemed to be exactly the right amount for a quiet evening. At 8:15, the ducks came knocking again. "No," Walter told them through the window. "I've been warned. You'll bring friends." They went quiet, and he went back to his book, until a much louder knock at the door turned out to be Nora, come to warn him the rain would continue all night and grow heavier around midnight. "Best night there is, to be on a boat," she said. "I was beginning to think so myself." By 10 he was ready for bed, in a room barely wider than the mattress, with just enough shelf space for his spectacles, his book, and a cup of water. He opened the curtain to a window only a foot or so above the canal, rain tracking down the glass in winding lines, lights glowing faintly through the trees on the far bank. He climbed in, switched off the lamp, and let the sounds of the boat settle around him. Rain on the roof, water against the hull, the occasional creak of a rope, the stove ticking gently as it cooled, and somewhere far off, a train crossing beyond the fields. There was no traffic, no television, no neighbor with a recycling bin. Only rain, until something nudged the side of the boat. Bump, then again, then a faint quack. Walter smiled into the dark. "Good night," he said, and the water lily rocked gently under him while the rain went on falling. Chapter 3. The Day That Stayed Indoors. Walter woke at 23 minutes past 7, though the digital clock had told him so, since the window itself had only managed to change from black to grey. Rain still covered the canal, heavier now than the night before, and Walter stayed exactly where he was. At Bramble Cottage he was always up shortly after 7. He had never understood lying in bed once he was already awake. Beds were for sleeping, chairs for sitting, tables for putting things on, and Walter liked his responsibilities kept clear. But the water lily seemed to run on different rules. The rain drummed steadily overhead, the boat moved gently. The duvet was warm, and when he next looked at the clock it read 4 minutes past 8. He had drifted off again without noticing, which impressed him rather more than it probably should have. He lit the stove, filled the kettle, and grinned when the pump gave its familiar hum. "You and me both," he said. While it boiled, he wiped the condensation from the window and watched the towpath turn glossy and dark, puddles forming between the trees, Nora's chimney already smoking. She appeared in her doorway with a mug a moment later, and the two of them simply raised a hand to each other across the water. Neither attempted conversation. It was, Walter thought, one of the real advantages of weather like this. He made porridge, found honey in Margaret's cupboard, sliced half a banana over the top, and ate breakfast by the stove while rain filled the whole morning. At 9:30 he put his coat on, thought better of it once he heard the rain hammering the roof, and took it off again. "No," he said, and made tea instead. There was, he decided, a real satisfaction in choosing not to go somewhere. By 11 he had reached the 19th century in his book, an age of busy canals and factories that depended on them, thousands of boats hauling goods the length of the country, whole families living aboard working narrowboats in spaces smaller even than the water lily. Walter looked around his own cabin and pictured it. Children, cargo, cooking, washing, working, perhaps a dog, possibly ducks. His current arrangement, he concluded, was decidedly the soft option. At 11:30, an elderly man in a wax jacket and flat cap knocked at the door. "Morning, I'm Arthur." He nodded towards a blue boat further up the bank. "Elsie May." "Walter." "I know." Walter wondered exactly how far his arrival had travelled along this stretch of canal. Arthur held out a small paper bag. Plums. Trees producing too many this year. There were about a dozen inside. Walter thanked him and offered tea, which Arthur accepted after a brief look at the rain, and 5 minutes later he was settled by the stove, telling Walter about 17 years on the canal, a career as a cabinet maker before that, and before that again, being young and foolish like everybody. He talked of frozen mornings and summer evenings, kingfishers and herons, and a swan that had once stolen an entire ham and mustard sandwich straight from his hand. Good sandwich? Very. That's what made it worse. At 12:30, Arthur went back to his own boat, and Walter finished the last of the cheese scones, making a private note to say nothing to Mrs Finch about how quickly they had gone. The afternoon settled around him without incident, which was exactly how he liked it. He washed a mug, fed the stove, made more tea, and at some point Stanley reappeared, curled up beside him, and both of them fell asleep for the better part of an hour. Walter woke to find the cat still there, and for a moment no idea where he was. Rain overhead, a canal outside the window, a ginger cat pressed against his leg. Then the stove clicked, and it all came back. "You are a bad influence," he told Stanley, who yawned and did not disagree. By 4:30, the rain had finally begun to ease, not stopping so much as softening, and this time Walter made it out through the door. The towpath smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke and damp earth. Water dripped steadily from every branch. The canal had turned the colour of polished pewter, and smoke rose straight up from the chimneys with barely a breath of wind to bend it. "Going far?" Nora called from beneath her tarpaulin, stacking logs. "Possibly to the bridge." Ambitious. The bridge was 300 yards off, and beneath its stone arch the world sounded entirely different, every drip and footstep echoing back at him, a bicycle crossing somewhere overhead on the road. Walter leaned against the old brickwork and looked along the canal, disappearing between the trees. No houses, no cars, nobody in sight, and for one brief moment wondered what it would be like simply to untie the water lily and keep going. Not far, not fast, just along, under bridges, past fields, stopping wherever tea seemed necessary. Then he remembered he had no idea how to steer a boat, and the idea lost most of its charm at once. He turned back. Nora had been right. The bridge was quite far enough. An umbrella, was hanging from his door handle when he got back, with a note attached. "Margaret says, 'The blue one leaks, Nora.'" Walter opened the umbrella he had brought from home indoors and found a small hole near one seam. "You people know everything," he said, to no one in particular. That evening he cooked scrambled eggs on toast and ate by the window as dusk gathered, the rain thinning to individual taps rather than one continuous sound. Afterwards he stood on the little back deck in the cool air, listening to water draining through the leaves and a moor-hen calling somewhere close by. The clouds were lifting, a pale strip of sky opening beyond the trees. Arthur smoking a pipe on his own deck, Nora visible through her open curtains under a yellow lamp, and further down the canal another boat had strung small, warm lights along its roof, their reflections trembling on the water. Walter realized he had spoken to more people that single rainy day than he sometimes managed in an entire dry week at home, and yet none of it had felt like effort. Nobody had demanded anything or overstayed. People had simply appeared, tea had happened, and then they had gone again. It might, he thought, be the best form of company there was. At 9, the rain came back properly, and Walter was glad of it. He changed into his pajamas, made one last cup of tea, and sat by the stove with his book, not bothering with the radio this time. He no longer needed it. The rain was company enough. Chapter 4. The Small Hours. At 17 minutes past midnight, Walter woke to find the rain much heavier than before, thundering against the roof, and the boat moving under him more than it had all evening. Rocking, not travelling. He sat up and listened for a moment, then got up to have a look, more out of curiosity than concern. The stove had nearly gone out, but the sitting room was exactly as he had left it. Book on the table, mug by the chair, no sign of Stanley. Through the curtain, the rain blurred everything outside into soft yellow circles where the towpath lamps burned. The mooring rope went taut, slackened, went taut again as the boat moved gently with the water. He remembered Arthur mentioning that the canal level could shift a little during heavy rain, nothing unusual, nothing that needed him, and let the curtain fall closed again. Before going back to bed, he filled the kettle anyway. There was something about waking in the small hours that made tea feel less like a drink and more like medicine, whether or not anything was actually wrong. He sat by the stove while it heated, added a small log, and watched the flames catch. 12:30, according to the clock above the kitchenette. Outside, the world had vanished entirely behind the rain. Walter drank his tea slowly, feet warming near the stove, and thought about how rarely he saw this particular hour at home. Midnight generally belonged to other people, night shift workers, taxi drivers, bakers, foxes, and the young eating kebabs somewhere in town. Walter usually surrendered the day by 11, but here he was, sitting alone on a boat at midnight, listening to rain and finding that he liked it rather a lot. Nobody would ring. Nobody would knock. Even the ducks, it seemed, had gone to bed. He thought of Bramble Cottage, his own kitchen and armchair, the hall clock that ran 2 minutes fast because he had never quite got round to fixing it. He was fond of home, very fond. But he suspected there was something useful in sleeping somewhere unfamiliar now and again, not because the unfamiliar place was better, but because coming home afterwards made the familiar one visible again. You noticed your own kettle, your own chair, the particular sound your own stairs made underfoot. Travel, Walter decided, was partly just a way of remembering what you liked about staying put. By 1 the rain had eased slightly and he went back to bed, the pillow cool against his cheek. A narrowboat passed somewhere in the distance, its engine a low, steady thrum growing closer, and for a few seconds a pale glow slid across the bedroom ceiling as its headlamp went by outside. Then the light and the sound both faded, and Walter found himself imagining whoever was out there in the wet dark, standing at the tiller under a canopy, and decided he did not need to know where they were headed. Within minutes he was asleep again, dreaming of impossible canals crossing rooftops and running through libraries, of Mrs Finch standing on some imaginary bank handing out cheese scones as the water slid past. He woke at 20 to 8, laughing, and could not for the life of him remember why. Chapter 5. After the rain. The rain had stopped. Walter noticed the quiet before he noticed anything else. For 2 days water had been tapping and drumming and trickling around him without pause, and now there was nothing. He opened the bedroom curtain onto morning sunlight, lying flat across the canal, every surface wet, the towpath shining, drops hanging from the willow branches and mist sitting just above the water. A robin was singing somewhere close by. He dressed, made tea, and stepped out onto the back deck, with the mug warming his hands. "Morning," Arthur called from further along. "Morning. Survived the storm, then?" Arthur considered the cloudless sky. Wasn't really a storm. Good. Nora appeared with a small bucket, Stanley trotting after her until he spotted Walter and changed direction entirely. "Traitor," Nora said, and the cat crossed the gangplank to let himself into the water lily as though he owned it. 5 ducks turned up minutes later, more than before. "I haven't fed them," Walter told her. "They've heard rumors." Breakfast was toast with honey, 2 of Arthur's plums, and the last cheese scone, eaten outside as sunlight found its way between the trees. A kingfisher flashed blue across the water so quickly, Walter almost doubted he had seen it, until Arthur, further along, pointed at the same spot. "Comes most mornings," he said. The bird did not come back, and Walter found he did not mind. Some things were better for being brief. By 10:30 he was packing, shirts back into the case, book, wash bag, slippers. The floor swept, though it hardly needed it. The worktop wiped, the logs stacked, the stove checked twice, and then, because he was Walter Bramble, a 3rd time for good measure. Margaret was due back that afternoon, so he left a note. "Dear Margaret, thank you for lending me water lily." Nothing sank. The ducks remain unfed. Stanley conducted 2 inspections. Arthur supplied plums, Nora supplied an umbrella, and your leek and potato soup was excellent. Walter. He added one more line before folding it. You were right about the rain. He locked the door and put the key back under the right flower pot. Nora came along the towpath as he was loading the car. "Off home?" "Afraid so." "Enjoy it?" Walter looked back at the water lily, sunlight gleaming on her wet roof, the brass chimney bright, the painted lilies along her side somehow brighter for the rain. "Very much. You'll be back. Everybody comes back to water in the end." Walter wasn't sure that was strictly true, but he liked the sound of it well enough. Arthur waved from his own deck, and Stanley watched him leave from the roof of Mabel Rose with an expression of complete and total indifference. 37 miles later he turned into Bramble Lane, where Mrs Finch was waiting at her gate before he had even switched off the engine. Well, it stayed afloat. Walter. He opened the boot and took out his case. There was a cat, several ducks. A man called Arthur gave me plums. Who's Arthur? I don't entirely know. It was wonderful, Mrs Finch. Her face took on the particular satisfaction of someone whose prediction had just been confirmed. I told you. Wasn't the rain lovely? Very. Though your blue umbrella leaks rather badly. Nora noticed. I've had that umbrella 12 years. Who's Nora? Again I couldn't say. Walter carried his case towards the cottage, Mrs Finch following as far as the gate. Margaret says you can use the boat again any time she's away. Walter looked up at the clear autumn sky over Bramble Lane, thought of the little stove, the canal, the willows, Stanley asleep beside him, a mug of tea at midnight, and rain travelling endlessly across a roof somewhere. Check the forecast, he said, and went inside. That night, in his own bed, there was no movement beneath the mattress, no water against the wall, no ducks knocking at the house. His room felt unusually solid around him. He lay awake for a few minutes, the silence somehow not quite complete, and then, just beyond the window, a few drops of rain began touching the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Walter smiled, pulled the duvet a little higher, and was asleep before the rain had properly begun.